too costly, too time consuming. So the US Navy people wanted to attack Taiwan. So MacArthur noticed that most of the people here are Americans. Very few Filipinos. The Filipinos were allowed to go back home, and that's why they became the crux or the nucleus of the guerrilla forces later on. So, MacArthur was trying to plan what he could, but again, very limited materials on hand, very limited forces. And by late 1942, a small U.S. counterattack began in the South Pacific, in Guadalcanal in August 1942, and one of the strategic decisions made in the Pacific. You have one enemy, the Japanese, but the United States split the Pacific into two. The Southwest Pacific Area Command under MacArthur, and you have the Pacific Ocean areas under a Navy admiral by the name of Admiral Nimitz. Why was that split done? It was better to have a united command, but the problem is, this is one thing that we don't understand too much today, is the rivalry between the Army and the Navy. MacArthur would not accept being under a naval commander, and Admiral Nimitz would not accept being under an Army commander. So they split. Into two. And those two sections moved on their own and had their own offensives. So the Pacific Ocean areas would move into the Central Pacific, bloody coral atolls, very bloody pictures of how the Marines landed in atolls in the Central Pacific. Many Marines died. The Japanese were really wanted to defend. On the other hand, MacArthur used what was called the leapfrog strategy, moving from New Guinea, one point to another, skipping the Japanese forces, landing where they were weak. What MacArthur learned in the Philippines was he had to have a combined air, sea, and land operation. Could not do it alone, by land, or air, or by sea. It has to be all three. That was also being discovered in the Central Pacific. By 1944, you have the Allied or the American offensive reaching a very crucial point. In June, July of 1944, the U.S. Navy with U.S. Army forces had reached the Marianas Islands. This is in the Central Pacific. The islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were invaded by the Americans. This was very crucial because Saipan and Tinian were held by the Japanese before the war, and therefore this was territory they considered their own. Guam, on the other hand, was an American island, and so for the Americans to retake it, this was the first real step of retaking American possessions from Japan. So if you look at the map, these are the two directions. MacArthur is coming from the south here, and Nimitz is coming from the central part. And you see the red line, that was the Japan defense perimeter. It should not be broken, because once the Americans took those islands in the Central Pacific, they could base bombers that could bomb Japan. So they had to fight for everything. The thing is, the islands fell. And once the islands fell, what was next? The Japanese worried, where are the Americans going to go? Is it going to be the Navy? Will they go to Japan? Or will it be MacArthur going to the Philippines? So there was that problem. And this is Admiral Nimitz, based in Pearl Harbor, commanding the naval forces. Interestingly, Nimitz and many of the American generals at that time, and admirals, served in the Philippines during the first decade of the 20th century. They had experienced warfare here in the Phil-American War or in the succeeding years. Nimitz himself might never have become an admiral because he had run his boat aground in the Philippines. I think it was just off summer where, because of a navigational error, his boat ran aground. Now, for any Navy commander to run your boat aground is almost the end of your career. But somehow he rode that over, and he became now the Admiral of the Pacific Ocean. So again, this shows two arrows, show the two drives, and looking at the map, you see that they would converge in the Philippines. And the thing is, if it converges in the Philippines, where in the Philippines will they strike? But the Japanese were worried too. What if they didn't strike the Philippines? What if they went straight to Japan? What if they went to Taiwan? What if they went to northern Japan? So the Americans began to plan. And as we saw, the two converging points would either reach the Philippines or Japan or Taiwan. And by 1943, MacArthur actually came up with a plan called Reno. And Reno was to attack the Philippines. Then 1944, that was revised. It became known as Musketeer. Both were basically the same. That MacArthur would capture New Guinea, and from New Guinea, move to the southern Philippines, move to Mindanao. And then from Mindanao, move to Leyte, and then from there on to Luzon. Washington, however, felt that this was too costly, too time-consuming. So the U.S. Navy people wanted to attack Taiwan. So MacArthur said, no, we have an obligation to return to the Philippines. So there would be a classic meeting in July of 1944 in Pearl Harbor. MacArthur was called to come to Pearl Harbor. We have an important meeting here. Of course, Admiral Nimitz was in Pearl Harbor too. And what MacArthur realized when he arrived in Pearl Harbor was he was meeting not only Admiral Nimitz, but he was also meeting President Roosevelt. It was a total surprise for him. And when they met, they had to decide, would they go to Taiwan? Would they skip the Philippines? In the end, they decided that the Philippines would be invaded, but it would be invaded in two sets, in 2 points. First, Mindanao in November 1944. That was called Operation King 2. And then once Mindanao, at least that part of Mindanao, southern area, that was now General Santos City area. Once they had the airfields there, they could cover with Leyte, and then Leyte could be invaded in December of 1944. So notice the time difference here. What happens here is October 20, and Mindanao is split. So you have these initial plans, and that was decided, among others, in Pearl Harbor. Nimitz is standing, you have MacArthur on the left, and you have Roosevelt listening to both sides. So yeah, this is MacArthur here. So, Leyte, why Leyte? Well, basically Leyte would be the convergence of both the Pacific Ocean areas and the Southwest Pacific areas. Defensive on both sides. The other advantage of Leyte was it was accessible from the Central Pacific or from the Philippine Sea, and also accessible to the Southwest Pacific. So MacArthur and Nimitz both could find Leyte useful. If Leyte was captured, it would cut the occupied Philippines into two, and therefore the Japanese would have their forces split, and once the Americans had air bases in Leyte, that would cut the Japanese supplies within the Philippine area. So in fact, MacArthur's historians would say Leyte was the anvil against which MacArthur would hammer the Japanese in the central Philippines into submission. That came from an official report. And then it would serve as a springboard for the conquest of Luzon. Very important in all these operations could be airfields. So Leyte had to be taken because airfields could be built here. The airport that we're using now, the Tacloban Airport, that was in existence during the war. That was a very key airport, very key airfield. The Japanese had developed it, they used it. There were other airfields the Japanese built. There was one in Dulag, there were 3 in the Burauen area, and those the Americans had to capture. So once they had captured that, no more Japanese Air Force, and then the Americans could control the air. Then the harbor, San Pedro Harbor. This morning when we flew in, I saw very clearly San Pedro Harbor. That's a natural fleet anchorage. We could bring ships there, repair them, replenish them, and so forth. So that makes Leyte very, very strategic. But to the Americans, Leyte had all these advantages. So this is the map of Musketeer. There you have King 1 in Mindanao, and then King 2 in Leyte. Then after that, they move up to Luzon. That was MacArthur's idea. The Navy felt, Mindanao, Leyte, okay. Luzon, not sure. But the Japanese also felt that the Philippines and Leyte was very important. From June of 1942 to May of 1944, Leyte, or rather the Philippines, was seen as a backwater. It was not the front line. It was a supply base, it was a rest and recreation base. Japanese soldiers who were tired from the South Pacific came to the Philippines to rest, get well, and then be sent south again. The Philippines was a major supply point, but no fighting, very few troops here. Now in 1944, the Japanese developed what they called the Z Plan. That was the decisive battle for the Central Pacific. Those plans were captured by guerrillas in Cebu, and that was modified by mid-1944 into the A Plan. Interesting to see how they use letters. So Z, then it became A. And they felt that the A Plan was the key to success. They would win the war. But when they sent their ships to the Philippine Sea, Guam, Saipan, they were very badly defeated. And so the Japanese had to come up with a new plan that would defeat the Americans once and for all. With the loss of Saipan, Tinian, Guam, the Marianas, that left the door open, in essence, to come to the Philippines and to Leyte. So the Japanese developed what they called the Shaw plans. Shaw in Japanese means victory. It's something that the Japanese were very wishful about. They thought, we will win this. We need a decisive battle. Japanese strategy was always founded on a final defensive battle, decisive battle, where everything would be set. Whether it was the Philippines, or Taiwan, or southern Japan, Okinawa, or northern Japan, any of these four would be the final defense and decisive plan for the Japanese. And they would throw everything into it, land, sea, and air forces. So, Imperial General Headquarters, this was the Japanese plans. So you see, when the hole was punched in the center, where would they go? Philippines, southern Japan, Taiwan, northern Japan. That was what they had to worry about. So they had these four plans. You send everything once the Americans land. The Japanese command structure was very complicated. There was Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, which gave the final decision to any plan. But there also was something called the Southern Army Headquarters, which was the regional headquarters for the whole of Southeast Asia. That was in May of 1944, based in Manila, under the command of Count General Yamaguchi. And the local army here was something called the 14th Area Army, which was under the command of Lieutenant General Kuroda. He was later replaced by Lieutenant General Yamashita. Yamashita, interestingly enough, arrives in Manila only on October 6, 1944. Remember, Leyte will be invaded on October 20. So Yamashita is just getting used to what the Philippines is. They've never been here, came from Manchuria, earlier Singapore, didn't know anything about this place. Even worse was his chief of staff. His chief of staff, who had worked with him in the Singapore campaign, arrived in the Philippines as an American air raid was taking place. So he had to jump out of his plane, landed in a mud puddle, and was driven by car to Manila. And when he reported to General Yamashita, he was all dressed in a dirty uniform, muddy and everything. And Yamashita said, looks like you need to take a bath. And so he said, he went and took a bath, changed his uniform, and then Yamashita said, you know, something happened today. That was October 20. So the Americans had invaded Leyte. And Yamashita's chief of staff, coming from Indonesia, didn't know anything. He said, very interesting, but where is Leyte? So Yamashita had to go to a map and point out there, it's there. Very strategic, very important. But apart from the 14th Area Army, if we talked about the US having the Navy and the Army as rivals, the Japanese had it even worse. The 14th Area Army was only the ground force. There was also an air force called the 4th Air Army. And the general for that was someone who was not even a flyer, and was not quite qualified to command an air force. Then there was the Imperial Japanese Navy, Southwest Area Fleet, much decimated. It had been defeated in many battles before, but now they were going to risk everything for a final defense in the show of land. When Yamashita took over, he looked things over and felt that the main defense of the Japanese should not take place anywhere else, but on Luzon, only Luzon. So this is General Terauchi. He was living in the Manila Hotel, and he was literally briefing down Yamashita, telling him what to do. And Yamashita was saying, I have to defend Luzon. But Tokyo gave orders, defend the Philippines wherever the Americans land. And so Terauchi believes that. He tells Yamashita, wherever the Americans land, fight and send everything there. So this is Terauchi. 14th Army Commander, we have General Kuroda. Kuroda was rather unpopular in Tokyo by this time because his idea on defending the Philippines was the Philippines simply can't be defended. So why bother? Why should we try to do anything? Sayang lang ang pagod. So what did he do? He lived in Manila Hotel, read the books in MacArthur's library in the MacArthur Suite, played golf, watched movies and stuff like that, paid no attention to defense. So when Tokyo finally heard that the commanding general's not doing anything, they pulled him out and they replaced him with General Yamashita. This is the commander of the 35th Army, which was in charge now of southern Philippines, Leyte, including the Visayas and Mindanao. This guy was based in Cebu, but once MacArthur landed in Leyte, he would transfer his headquarters here, at Ormoc, on the west side of Leyte. So they realized that Leyte was extremely crucial and to be defended. Other Japanese commanders, this is General Tomitaga, commander of the 4th Air Force, who didn't fly, was not a particularly good leader, and it said that his only claim to fame at that time was ordering kamikaze pilots to their death. And then when he escaped and was captured by the Russians. The Navy has another commander. The staff commander was based in Japan, Admiral Toyoda, and this was a classic Japanese admiral. Wanted again the last ditch battle if he fought against the Americans anywhere he came. So as all of this goes in, Leyte was suffering under the Japanese occupation. So like the rest of the Philippines, Leyte was plunged into military rule. It was a civil government under Governor Torres. And as we'll hear later on in more detail, there were guerrilla units. There was a very strong rivalry between two guerrilla commanders, Miranda and Cangleon. But these guerrilla units operated against the Japanese. They printed their own currency. They made contact with MacArthur, and they got supplies from American forces in Australia. The Japanese garrison in Leyte was the 16th Division, which came from the Kyoto area. It wasn't looked on very highly by the Japanese army because they said Kyoto is a center for merchants and not warriors, unlike southern Japan where they were more fighters. So he said the 16th Division was weak. Now the 2nd Division was interesting also because it's based that fought in Bataan. And so Tokyo felt this was a weak division because they couldn't defeat Japan in time. So the Japanese planned to bring in reinforcements from wherever they could. And so this is what we call Mickey Mouse money. It's this that circulated all over the Philippines. This circulated here as well. And it eventually had no more value towards the end of the war. The guerrillas put out their own emergency currency like this. This was actually printed in Tacloban. And the circulation was only within Leyte. So if you were caught with Mickey Mouse money, if the guerrillas caught you with Mickey Mouse money, they would say you were a Japanese collaborator and they would execute. If the Japanese caught you with this, they said you were a guerrilla and they would execute you also. So extremely difficult conditions there. Now, submarines brought in weapons, brought in uniforms, medicines, and other things. And among other things, which many people remember from that time, they brought in these propaganda items from General MacArthur. What you see on the top are cigarettes. I shall return you, Douglas MacArthur. On the left, we have a matchbook, again with his portrait, and I shall return. The bottom right is an interesting relic because this is a mirror. And you were supposed to use this to signal American planes that you were in that location. So again, it has I shall return, MacArthur's portrait, and so this is very effective propaganda. Well, the guerrillas tended to look like this. They didn't have guns, and they used their bladed weapons. So this is in Leyte in 1944. So the turning point will take place in September of 1944. At this time, we have the U.S. Navy begin to raid with aircraft carriers Mindanao and Central Philippines, Visayas, and then eventually even Luzon, Northfield, and even Manila. And in these raids, the carrier commander, Admiral Halsey, realized that the Japanese were very weak. Their anti-aircraft was very poor, their aircraft were not good, the pilots were being shot down, and very few of them came up anyway. So Halsey concluded that the Japanese forces were light in the field and suggested, or recommended, that Leyte be attacked as soon as possible. So this is September of 1944. MacArthur's own intelligence assessment was not that the Japanese were weak. The guerrillas were telling him where the Japanese were, and MacArthur was reading Japanese codes. And the Japanese code said that Leyte is going to be reinforced by larger forces later on. So MacArthur knew that Halsey's own recommendation that the Japanese were very weak was not true. So anyway, it was strong enough for some plans to be cancelled, and MacArthur would actually receive the news after a very crucial invasion, that of the island of Morotai to the south. Other islands were cancelled, other islands continued to be sent. And when the news of the weakness of the Japanese here in Leyte reached the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they were in Canada at that time, they were in Quebec. In fact, they were having dinner at night. They had all of these top officers, 5-star generals and admirals. They were having dinner, and the cable came. Halsey says, attack the Philippines now. The Japanese are very weak. And so the Americans left the room, they had to talk. What do we do? And he said, all right, let's decide. Send a message to MacArthur, attack as soon as possible. And that was concurred in by MacArthur's chief of staff at that time. And after that, you would have the Air Force, the Japanese, aircraft carriers attacking Taiwan, other bases, and that would cause the Japanese Navy and the Japanese Army to conclude that the Americans were going to attack. Late September, early October, and they decided to start Show 1 and Show 2, either Taiwan or either the Philippines, not very clear. Turned out to be false alert. There were many false alerts that the Japanese had at this time. So when the final news came that MacArthur had actually landed in Leyte, they thought this might be false news again. And today we talk about false news. Imagine if military commanders get false news like this and make their decisions out of this. So the Japanese were really based on very controversial decisions. These were what the American aircraft carriers looked like. It's these that were raiding Mindanao and raiding the Central Philippines and particularly Leyte itself. So with this strength, it was felt that the Japanese would easily be knocked off, and MacArthur would even go to the extent of rely on this rather than land aircraft. MacArthur's plan was always capture a base, move to the next base, retain the aircraft in that base, and then move further on. This invading Leyte was a calculated risk. One, it was beyond the range of MacArthur's planes, and therefore he would have to depend on these, the Navy. The Navy didn't want to be tied down to MacArthur or things like this. Second calculated risk, October 20 is the midst of the rainy season. It's the center part of the typhoon season. MacArthur knew that. He said, are we going to attack when the rains are falling? Remember, the first plan was Mindanao is attacked in November and Leyte will be attacked in December. That had climatic conditions considered. Because if they attack Mindanao, no problem with typhoons. November, okay, safe. December, the typhoon season in Leyte would have passed. October, however, was typhoon season there. And so MacArthur said, I will take the risk. Let's land on October 20th. Well, what happens after that is a lot of controversy. Anyway, so these were the aircraft carriers. That means they said anything to challenge them. This was the Carrier Force Admiral, Admiral Halsey, and Manila being bombed. Interestingly enough, the first bombing of Manila took place on September 21, 1944. The same day that we commemorate Proclamation 1081 or martial law. So September 21 seems like a rather interesting day. Anyway, so invasion plans were cancelled. The whole of the Mindanao operation was skipped, and instead smaller invasions were carried out. And Leyte, it was decided, was to be invaded on October 20, 1944. So again, calculated risk. The rains might come. Never mind, bahala na. They're going to invade. Okay. The Japanese can be knocked off. This is where we have red, white, and the other beaches, all on the eastern coast of Leyte, Palaon Island in the south, to establish a torpedo boat base, and then Dinagat, Siluan, and Homonhon as preliminaries. That was what was going on today, 80 years ago. The Japanese would now realize this is the real threat. And so they would declare the Show 1 operation into effect. And that meant the total defense of Leyte. Yamashita wanted to save his forces for Luzon, but the Japanese in Tokyo would say Leyte has to be the center of the decisive battle. And so, to make things short, this is what Red Beach looked like about 10:30 in the morning of October 20. It was not a peaceful landing. There was a lot of shooting, machine gun fire, mortars being fired at that time. There were casualties the Americans suffered. So this is what the first wave looked like. Once the invasion had been done, you now have the supply ships coming in and bringing all the weapons, bringing all the supplies down. Now, one of the places where they landed a great deal of supplies was right next to Tacloban Airport. Next to Tacloban Airport is the sea. You see the eastern side of Tacloban Airport, open to the sea. There you have all the landing craft like this landing, and all the supplies landed on the airfield, to the point that the airfield could not be used. And MacArthur's air officer was so angry to get those supplies off the field because I need that for my planes. I have to land my planes here, and I'm going to bulldoze those supplies if you don't move them as soon as possible. Well, the supplies were moved after that, but the rains came, and as we know, the rains can be very, very tedious. They can be very dangerous. And all the roads in eastern Leyte became swamps and quagmires. And the airfields that had been captured could not be used anymore. They were too wet, they were too muddy. When the conditions settled down, you have Filipinos, Leyteños, actually welcoming the Americans like this. So it's rather strange that compared to the two slides earlier, where we had the fighting in A-Day, you have Filipinos welcoming the Americans like this. There are even more dramatic photos of them jumping up and down, actually. Of course, the most famous picture of them all, MacArthur landing with Ismenia and the others. And MacArthur being on the ground would also pose with local people. Is Kang Leon meeting with the Civil Affairs Advisor of MacArthur. On the left side, you have Joseph Ralston Hayden, was the Civil Affairs Officer, and on the right side, you have the Staff Officer of Kang Leon. The guerrillas played a very big role in all of this fighting also. Here we have one of the few pictures of guerrillas in action attacking Japanese in Leyte. But this would be the start of a long campaign. Nobody knew on the American side that the Japanese were going to risk everything. And they risked everything. They risked all of their ships, They list all of their land forces. They list their air forces. It's here that the kamikaze is born out of desperation. Some of the troops that came here would come all the way from Japan, from Okinawa, or from China even, and they all landed in Manila or they were brought from Mindanao. So this eventually led to the end of the Japanese armed forces because everything was sent here. One of the forces that was sent here and just fought in the Kapuakan area, what's called Breakneck Ridge, was the 1st Division. This was the gem of the Japanese division. It was the most professional, the oldest division in the Japanese army. It had a very strong tradition. MacArthur didn't know that that division was coming to Leyte in 5 days. So what he thought would take only 1 month actually lasted until May of 1945. By Christmas Day, he declared the campaign officially over, changed the command structure. The 6th Army went to Luzon, and this was later fell under the 8th Army. But the mopping up operations would continue all the way until May of 1945. It was a bloody campaign all the way to the end, but it had been surpassed or had been overshadowed by other invasions. Mindoro in December, and then later on Luzon in December. So a long campaign. I don't have time to discuss this, but this is the Japanese supply system, aircraft coming from Taiwan, from Mindanao, even from Indonesia. Japanese officers planning the defense of Leyte. These are Japanese landing craft landing in Ormoc. So all that stuff they would send was going through Ormoc. They even sent paratroopers in December. So this, they really risked everything. And in the end, making short, this is a kamikaze, missing an American carrier, taking place just off our shores here. And even Tacloban itself was not spared. This was a transport that was being hit by Japanese bombers within the port of Tacloban. So anyway, these are the sources that I used among others. But anyway, that's the beginning of a long campaign. And once again, it will officially come to an end only in May of 1945. So let me end there. Thank you very much for your attention. Good afternoon.